Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us again. I also want to thank all those people who participated and donated in our annual campaign that we finished last week. It was a success. We managed to reach and also surpass our original goal of 1,250,000 shekel. And we saw a very nice amount of people who also participate in this program, who donated, who were part of also the activities in Toronto Zion. So thank you to all of you. If anyone missed it, so there's obviously an opportunity. The page is still open. You can still donate. But that being said, we're going to allow Rabbi Sussman to take it from here. Bevakasha.
Okay, good morning. Good to see you all as always, and as looking forward to meeting you all again in person. Who knows? Maybe already the next time we'll be able to be in an in-person shir. But in the meantime, I also want to apologize just a little bit for I'm using an older computer. That's why my screen looks as though it's a 1980s television set. I was hoping that if I looked this way, that I also would look the way that I looked in the 1980s, but that doesn't seem to go hand in hand. In any event, but it does the job. So I'd like to talk about a specific idea that comes out of this week's parsha. And the middle of the parsha is really very rich in terms of mitzvot. The mitzvot not necessarily that are kept today, but certainly that we can sort of learn from, whether it's first the Sotah, then it's what we're going to be focusing on, the Nazir. And they're within the context of the Nazir, just to give a very quick overview. Nazir is a person, man or woman, who takes upon themselves, there are different kinds of Nazirim as well, but basically the core Nazir is somebody who takes upon themselves to refrain, to become a person who is kadosh. And the Nevi'im, and we'll see this reference to Amos, talks about Nazir and Navi in the same breath. Shimshon, is of course the most famous Nazir, but it could very well be that Shmuel was also a Nazir. The idea that a person is going to take upon themselves a certain level of restriction in order to come closer to God, and that's something which is open to every person. It's not something which is restricted the way that being a Kohen is restricted to a specific family, or Levi is being restricted to a specific tribe. It's something which is open to everyone. So this is something which has very powerful, if you think about a very powerful spiritual drive to it. And in terms of the halachot, so then basically it's an open-ended period. It can be as long, it can be defined by the person. Chazal understood based on the drasha that, based on the gematria actually, the word Nazir Yihiyeh, he will be, and the gematria of that is 30 days, that if a person accepts Nizirut for without defining how long it would be, Stam Nizirut is Shloshim Yom, it's 30 days. And for that period of time, the person really has two major restrictions. One is that they refrain from all grape products, starting with wine, but including all grape products, and including raisins, grapes themselves, etc. And the second is that they are three things, excuse me, that they grow their hair. They cannot shave or take haircuts during that period of time. And finally, that during that period of time, they are also like Kohanim, or even like a Kohen Gadol, are not allowed to become tameh to a mate. They're not allowed to become defiled by coming into contact with any person who is deceased, including a close relative. The only exception, like a Kohen Gadol, is what the halacha defines as a meit mitzvah, namely somebody who is there is no one else to bury that person. then both the Kohen Gadol and the Nazir are allowed to become tameh in order to tend to that individual. But other than that, the Nazir is not allowed to become tameh. At the end of the Nazirut, the Nazir brings korbanot. That also can, and that includes, and this is what we're going to be focusing on, a korban chatat, a sin offering. Also, the part of the that there can be korbanot if the Nazirut is brought to a we'll say a a premature end, namely that if the Nazir did become tameh, so then he or she has to go through the normal purification process of tumat met, and at that point brings several korbanot, and then will resume the Nazirut. This is all delineated, obviously, greater length in the Torah Shabbal Peh and the Mishnayot of Masechet Nazir and the Gemara Masechet Nazir. But there is a great deal of detail that the Torah itself gives us here in our parsha in Perek Vav of Sefer Bamidbar. The pasuk that I want to focus on, though, is with regard to that korban chatat. The Torah says here, "Va'asa kohen," we have the very first source, "Va'asa kohen echad lechatat ve'echad le'olah." Takes these two rams and two sheep actually, and brings one as a korban chatat and one as a korban olah, a sin offering and a burnt offering. V'chiper alav me'asher chata al hanefesh. So now the Torah says explicitly he will needs kapara. It's not just simply a korban chatat. There are other people who bring korban chataot, where their sin is not necessarily clear. So, for example, a mitzorah will bring a person who's a leper, a person who was a zav or a zava. They have various flows that are coming that are not normal in terms of their tumah. They bring a korban chatat. A woman who gives birth brings a korban chatat. So it's not totally clear why they should bring korban chatat. There isn't a particular sin that's been involved there, and that's a discussion that's involved. And we could have said a Nazir is one of those categories where there's a sin offering, perhaps a general type of sin offering for this person, without describing a specific problem. But here the Torah goes out of its way to say that the Nazir requires kapara, requires to have some kind of atonement. V'chiper alav me'asher chata al hanefesh.
Excuse me, could you please enlarge the print, please?
Sure. Let's see. Okay. V'chiper alav, is that better? Is that better in terms of the size?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, good. So so here it says, so I'll just put it into, I will highlight it. V'chiper alav me'asher chata al hanefesh. So the Torah says that he or she requires kapara for that which he has sinned on the soul. V'kideshet rosho bayomahu, and he will also needs to shave his head on that day, sanctify his head. So the question becomes, well, all right, now we, having said that, so how do we look at this in terms of this kapara? And here the Gemara it's really an agadic piece, but it takes this idea one step further. The Gemara Nazir, the Tanit, and it appears elsewhere as well. The Gemara says, Amar Shmuel, Kol HaYoshev b'Ta'anit nikre chote. Whoever takes upon themselves a fast is called a sinner. Savar ki haitanim. Now, the background for this is that besides the ta'aniyot that we're familiar with, in terms of what we call ta'anit sibur, where the community as a whole takes upon itself a fast, and that in of itself breaks into two groups. One with regard to commemorating events of the past. Tisha B'Av is the the key, but also the other so-called minor fasts that are around it, Shivasar B'Tammuz, Tzom Gedalia, etc. And those commemorate events that occurred in the past. There is also a public fast of when there is some kind of crisis, and that the community needs to come together in prayer, and Ta'anit is a form of prayer. That is the classic example, is if there is, God forbid, some kind of batzaret, there's some kind of break in the rain pattern here in Israel, and we have the various Taniyot. There is also, however, the possibility that exists for individuals to accept upon themselves fasts for different reasons, either because they are experiencing a personal crisis and they want to use the fast as a means to bring them closer to God in that period of time, or because they feel that it is a means of doing tshuva. But Shmuel says that this is not necessarily a positive phenomena. So where does Shmuel get this idea from? Savar ki haytana. So the Gemara says that Shmuel is of the opinion, as already mentioned, of a Tana, Rebbe Lezer Hakapar Barabi. So Rebbe Lezer Hakapar Barabi said the following: Ma Talmud lomar v'chiper alav misher chata al hanefesh v'chi be'eze nefesh chata zeh. What sin, what soul did this person sin against? Ella shetzier atzmo min hayayin. The sin is that he or she has now taken upon themselves an additional restriction that didn't exist. Wine is a pleasurable drink, and this person has now taken a ban on wine products for the month. V'halot dvarim kal v'chomer u'ma zeh shelo tzier atzmo ela min hayayin nikra choteh hamitzaer atzmo mikol davar v'davar alachat kama v'kama. So if the Torah views the Nazir by definition as being a sinner, so this person is has to now bring a korban chatat. So all the more so if you decide to refrain from eating anything over this period of time. So you're certainly considered to be a sinner. Now, immediately the Gemara brings another opinion in the Amoraim. Shmuel is an Amora. The Gemara is connecting it to this position, Tanaitic position. But so we have Shmuel on the one hand, and we have, maybe we'll change the color here for his position just to keep that again. And now we have Rebbe Lazar, who is an Amora in Eretz Yisrael, living at the same time as Shmuel. And he says, no, a Nazir is not only not called a Choteh, he's called a Kadosh, Nikra Kadosh. So he's called he views him as someone who is a saint. Shene'emar Kadosh Yihiyeh Gadal Pera Se'ar Rosho. With regard, another pasuk in the parsha, with regard to the hair growth of the Nazir, so it is called Kadosh. So here we have this idea that this person who has only taken upon himself one particular restriction is called a holy individual. So so all the more so if somebody has taken everything. So here we have a radical machloket, really polar opposites. On the one hand, Shmuel is saying that someone is considered to be a sinner if he does this. Rebbe Lazar is saying that he's not only not considered to be a sinner, he's considered to be a kadosh. Now, the Gemara continues and says, well, how do they each deal with their source text, the other source text? So the Gemara says, Shmuel ha'ikre kadosh, you have this idea of kedusha. So he says, no, that is referring to ha'agidul perakai. That's only referring to the hair growth, meaning that the hair is going to be set aside. Once the hair is cut off, so then it's not used for anything. And that's the idea of kadosh, a notion of separation being put aside. Rebbe Lazar, Hanikra Chote, we have the idea of Chote. So he says, no, Hahu Desa'ev Nafshe, that's only referring to someone who became Tameh. In other words, the Chet, according to Rebbe Lazar, isn't the Nizirut, but rather the inability of this particular individual to have lived up to the standards of Nazirut. He took upon himself this idea of Kedusha, and he stumbled, he fell, he became Tameh. So then he has to bring a Korban Chatat. So that is the focus. The last line was a mistake on the cut and paste. That's a continuation of another Gemara. So that's where you have this this machloket. Maybe I'll just get rid of it now, so for future. So that, there you go. So now the Gemara continues and says that those are the two positions in the Gemara. Do we view this as being someone who's a chotel, someone's not being a chotel? Now, the Ramban in his Perush, so he actually is not referring to this pasuk Yud Aleph that we started with. He's talking about a little bit later in pasuk Yud Daled, where the idea of a korban chatat is mentioned for a Nazir when they finish the Nazirut after the full period of time. They didn't become Tameh. Now, the first pasuk was important because, as I said, that pasuk had said explicitly that v'chiper alav asher chata al hanefesh. That requires kapara. In the subsequent pasuk Yud Daled, that phrase doesn't appear. But the Ramban takes this idea quite seriously, and he takes the position of seemingly of Rebbe Lazar. He says the following: Tamachatat yakriv hanazir biyom elot yimein Israel lo nitparesh. The Torah never tells us why he should bring a korban chatat at the end of his 30-day period. V'al derech hapshat. So now the Ramban says, what is the pshat? Ki ha'ish hazeh choten nafsho bimlot hanizirut. So this person is a sinner when he finishes his nizirut. Ki hu ata nazur mikdushato v'avodat Hashem. So why is he considered to be a sinner? He's a sinner because he's finishing the Nazirut. Right now, he is a person who is Nazur. Nezer is a crown. He's crowned with this extra level of sanctity that he has taken upon himself. And Ra'uihu hayalo shiazir la'olam. If we are viewing this as something which is positive, you are taking steps, individual steps, personal steps, to make yourself a more holy individual. And really, you should never finish that state of kedusha. And because of that, because you are now finishing the kedusha, after 30 days or 30 years for that matter, if that's how long your neder was, but it is a finite period of time. You're finishing this period of time, so that is considered to be a sin. And he quotes, as I mentioned before, the pasuk in Amos, "Va'akim mibnechem l'neviim u'mibachurechem l'nezirim." So the Navi says that as an ideal, God says, I will take all of your sons, or from your sons, I will take them to become Nevi'im, and I will take Bachurim to be Nazirim. This is parallel to becoming a Navi. One might even make an argument from the Pasuk that now's not the time to get into this particular discussion, but being a Navi, according to many, most famously the Rambam, you don't just become a Navi because God has decided to speak to you. You first have to go through a period of self-perfection, to reach a level where you are deserving or able to be the instrument for God. You know, it's the Navi, if you want to take that term, the instrument. So the musician needs an instrument to play. So a Navi is God's instrument. And if the Navi doesn't turn himself or herself into a violin, he or she remains just a piece of wood, so then the violinist just has nothing to play. It could be that to become a Navi, the person has to also be a Nazir. We have to take specific steps that are going to make you into a more kadosh person, and Nazirut is part of that. In any event, the Amos compares the two. He puts them in the same pasuk as a parallel one to the other. Another pasuk in the back in our parsha, Kol Yemei Nizro Kadosh Hu Lashem. As long
You've just muted yourself.
Okay. Hold on a second. I'm having a little trouble. So so basically, the person becomes a Nazir, and that is parallel to becoming Kadosh. So the rationale for that is now the key line here in the Ramban is Hinehu tzarich kapara. He requires some kind of atonement. Why? B'shuvo lihitameh b'tavot ha'olam. That's a very powerful line. He's saying that here you have returned to becoming to the pleasures, the desires, the passions of this world. That is something that requires atonement, and that is something also that lihitama, he's become tameh. So this is that's the Ramban. It would seem that the Ramban is taking the approach then of Rabbi Lazar. The Rambam, on the other hand, in Hilchot Deot, in the Mishnah Torah, so he seems to go in the other direction. He quotes our Gemara directly. The Ramban didn't quote the Gemara directly. He refers to it. As I said, the implication of the Ramban is that he is like taking the position of Rebbe Lazar, but it's not totally clear. However, the Rambam is quite clear. The Rambam says, Shema Yomar, perhaps a person will say, source number 3, so this is after going through discussing why these character traits, jealousy, passion, seeking honor, are basically negative character traits. Eventually can take a person out of this world, meaning can set him back many steps from a spiritual perspective. So since they're so terrible, so I'm going to go in the other direction. Lo yochal basar, lo yishte yayin, lo yisa isha, lo yeshev b'dira na'a, lo yilbash malbush da'eh, el hasak v'atzemer hakasher chiyotze behen, k'gon kohanei ovdei kochavim. So he takes a direct swipe at the monistic existence, and he says, a person will become a monk, will become a nun, and that specifically, gam zeh derech ra'ahi va'asur leilech ba, hamahalech b'derech zeh nikra choteh. So if you do this, you are called a sinner. Shaharehu omer benazir v'chiper alav me'asher chata ala nefesh. Amru chachamim u'ma im nazir shelo piresh ela min hayayin tzarich kapara hamonea atzmo mikol davar v'davar lachat kama v'kama. So he takes Shmuel's position explicitly. So he says that a person is going to be considered to be a sinner. Lefikach Tzivu chachamim shelo yimana adam matzmo midvarim shemenato haTorah bilvad. So therefore the chachamim commanded. This is now taking something which the Gemara did not say, but the Rambam, is extrapolating from the Gemara and saying that the Chachamim have, note the term tzivu, right? A very strong term that they have commanded us to not refrain from anything other than what the Torah itself has demanded from us. V'lo yeh oser atzmo b'didarim u'shvuot al dvarim hamutarim. Kach amru chachamim lo dayech ma she'asra Torah el shata oser alecha dvarim acherim. It's not enough what the Torah said. You have to take other things as well. U'b'klal zeh elu shemit'anin tamid eino b'derech tova v'asru chachamim sheyeh adam misagef atzmo b'tanit. So the chachamim have forbidden people from afflicting themselves with excessive fasting. This is the position of the Rambam. So if we just took a look at this Rambam and this Ramban, finish the shir right now, we'd say, okay, there is these two different approaches that have already been expressed by the Amoraim. If we look strongly enough, we can perhaps find them in these different positions already in earlier rabbinic sources. You can perhaps argue that there are even different strands within the Tanakh itself. There are different approaches, and perhaps there are going to be times where a person will, where it's considered to be excessive. At other times, it's considered to be something which is positive. The Rishonim, when they're trying to understand why is there an issue for if Nazir, according to Shmuel, is a negative, why do we have this this function at all? Why does the Nazir exist in the Torah? And the answer is, or why do we allow for a person to take fasts upon themselves today? And the answer is that perhaps there are times, and the Rambam himself says that there are times that the person, much along the lines of a person who is ill, takes to take steps that for a healthy person would be difficult for their health. At the same time, because they're ill, they have to that requires extraordinary measures. Similarly, spiritual health, if a person is in a state where they're not spiritually healthy, however you're going to define that, that also might require extraordinary measures. So that's something which is possible, and we could finish our discussion right now. However, this becomes a problem in the Rambam himself, and we're going to see in the Ramban as well, because they seem to contradict themselves. And also, and then we'll go on from there to a really fascinating Gemara and the understanding that Rav Kook had of that Gemara, where we can see that perhaps this kind of dialectic that we have to deal with in terms of this this yin and yang, in terms of our being able to experience and take pleasure in this world, and at the same time our desire to become holy and perhaps refrain from some of those carnal pleasures. So this is something which is a deeply embedded in the Jewish psyche, and that tension that exists, and perhaps that tension itself is a healthy tension. But first, let's take a look at the contradictions that seem to exist in the Rambam, and perhaps I'll try to. I don't know if I'm going to be able to actually answer them totally. The Rambam says the following: the Rambam Mor Nevuchim, immediately after we just read this piece in Hilchot Deot, where the Rambam says that the Nazir is a choteh, and the Rambam, on the other hand, in Mor Nevuchim, the Rambam says, when he, in his section, in the third chelek of Mor Nevuchim, of the guide, he speaks of the ta'amei ha-mitzvot. He gives explanations for what the mitzvot are, the rationale for them, and he comes to Nazirut, And with Nazirut, he doesn't really have to break a sweat, if you will, in terms of understanding why we have Nazirut. Tam Nazirut mevuar ma'od. So the Rambam says that it's very clear, it's very obvious why there is the mitzvah of Nazirut. V'hu ha'prishut min hayayin asher hifsid bin harishonim va'achronim rabim va'atzumim kol harugav. V'chol gam ele biyayin shagu. Basically, of course, we're going to have it's laudable to refrain from wine. Wine, alcohol, is a very dangerous drug, and it has created many negative effects on person individually and on a community wide level. ובא מדין הנזירות מה שתראה מאיסור כל אשר יעשה בגפן היין להרחקה יתרה עד שיספיק לאדם ממנו הדבר הצריך. So we take the Nazir takes it to the nth degree. So you can't even have a raisin. But the point is because you're trying to stay away from wine. כי הנשמר ממנו נקרא קדוש. So the Rambam now explicitly takes the position of Rebbe Lazar, as opposed to what he said earlier, Nikra Choteh. Here it's Kinishma Mimenu Nikra Kadosh. He's considered to be a holy individual. V'husam b'madregat Kohen Gadol b'kedusha. Because, as I said earlier, that with regard to the level of Tuma, or the Isur of Tuma, it's equivalent to a Kohen Gadol. And this is something which is a very laudable thing that the individual takes upon herself or himself, and this is the idea that the Rambam says here in Moreh Nevuchim in the guide, as opposed to what he said in the Mishneh Torah. Now, this idea of the Rambam really fits in with a general theme that the Rambam has and is really brought to bear in Moreh Nevuchim in several places. The Rambam, as an Aristotelian, as perhaps a Neoplatonist, the Rambam is very much believes in an ascetic ideal. The Rambam does not believe that this world is something which has much to speak for it in terms of our physicality. Physicality is an impediment to the intellect, and the ideal is pure intellect. The Rambam's vision of Olam Haba is pure intellect, which is able to, for each one of us, Be'ezrat Hashem, to be able to commune with the intellect, with the capital I, namely with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and that our bodies is an impediment to that. It's no coincidence, for example, that when the Rambam speaks of the prophetic experience, so the prophetic experience is one of negation of with the possible exception of Moshe Rabbeinu, that there is a negation of the physical. The Navi only has his vision when he is asleep. The Navi is basically paralyzed during the course of the vision. And it's because the body is something which would be an impediment to communing with God, and that, of course, is what Nevuah is all about. And here the Rambam says in source number 5, he says this in a very extreme manner. He says, "V'hiyeh," I'm just looking at in the bold here. "Yeh mi shekvar hitpatla machshavto v'tshukato le'inyanim habehemiyim." So a person who cancels out his thoughts, his desire to those animal instincts. Ritzoni lomar bechirat tanug hamachal v'hamishteh v'hamishkal. Specifically, choosing the pleasures of food, of drink, of sex. Ubilvad hachush hamimashesh and specifically our tactile senses. Asher bier Aristo b'midot v'amar k'shezeh hachush cherpa lanu. So quoting Aristotle, that these senses is something which is shameful for us. Uma tov ma she'amar ki be'emet hu cherpa. Now, the Rambam says, after quoting Aristotle, he not only doesn't disagree, he gives it a two-handed approbation. It is indeed shameful. Mipnei shehu lanu me'asher anachnu ba'alei chayim v'lo davar acher keshar habeimot ve'ein bo davar me'inyan ha'enoshut. Very, very strong formulation. This has nothing to do with our humanity. This has nothing to do with being a human being. It has perhaps everything to do with being a clever primate, but it has nothing to do with being a human being. And as much as you're able to remove yourself from that shame, that is admirable. Really a polar opposite of what he said in the Mishnah Torah in Hilchot Deot. It was just as strongly as the Rambam, and he speaks in Hilchot Deot against excessive fasting, against a monistic existence. Here, the Rambam is saying that this is really the ideal existence, and that we need to negate our animal instincts. The Ramban, on the other hand, who had, as we saw, talked about the Nazir being a kadosh, so he pushes back against the Rambam. Now, I'm going to just take a short paragraph from what's known as the Igeret HaKadosh, the holy letter of the Ramban. It is miyuchas to the Ramban. We don't know with 100% assurity that the Ramban was the author, but this is certainly the consensus, is that he was the author. In any event, it's coming from someone from his school, and we'll see the things that the Ramban himself wrote, definitely wrote, which also would give a support for this position. So here, the Ramban takes the Rambam out specifically with regard to this last paragraph that we just read. And the Ramban says the following: Ein hadavar kasher chashav harav zal b'moreh hanevuchim biyoto mishabeach la'aristo al ma she'amar ki chush hamishush hu cherpa lanu. So there can be nothing. It is not at all what the Rambam thought when he quoted Aristotle. Chalila, God forbid, right? This is here. People are speaking quite strongly and stridently. This is God forbid. Eina davar kamosha amar hayivani. Things are not at all the way that Greek said it. Lefi shidato hayivani yeshemetz minut sheino murgash. That the Greek idea, the Aristotelian notion, is besmirched by a sense of heresy, which the Rambam missed. She'ilu haya ma'amin she'olam mechudash b'chavana lo haya omer kach zeh hayavani hablial. If he thought that the world had been created by God, he never would have said this cursed Greek would never have said this. Aval kol ba'alei haTorah ma'aminim she'Hashem bara et hakol kefi ma shegazra chokhmato v'lo bara davar sheyeh genai o chi'ur. God created everything, and if he created everything, there is nothing in this world. And he talks. This is a line where this is within a larger text dealing with sexuality in particular, that basically he created nothing that would be considered to be derogatory or ugly. He's saying that the reason why Aristotle can say this is because Aristotle believed in a God which had nothing to do with our world. Both God and the world were eternal. God was not the creator. And so therefore you could look at the world and say that this world is that by its definition is apart from God, and we are part of this world. But if we want to be part of with God, so then we have to separate ourselves. That makes sense. But we who believe that God created the world, so how could we possibly say that God created something which is cherpa lanu, which is something which is a shameful for us? God would never create that. So God, everything that God creates is fine. So there is nothing ugly in God's creation. However, after we'll skip a couple of lines. Aval ha'adam biyot sachal mevi kiur b'dvarim she'en bahem kiur mitchila v'haven ze mi'od. That it is man, the Ramban says, who brings ugliness into something which isn't ugly at all. Well, it's and again, within the context of sexuality, that would be a larger discussion in terms of what the Ramban is trying to get at. But the idea that there is nothing which is truly ugly in God's creation, that is a human construct, and so therefore it would follow. And he says this elsewhere as well. I didn't bring it here, but within the context of the Igeret. So then you have a responsibility to take what is beautiful in this world and to sanctify it and to channel it. That is, and specifically again, touching upon sexuality, but that's not really the focus of our discussion today. But that's the idea, though, is to take a look at the world as being something which is very positive, because God created it, and He created us as part of the world. So that's something which is very positive, and we should be channeling that to the service of God. If that's the case, right? So we have a really very difficult situation here, that the Rambam is contradicting himself. The Ramban is also seemingly contradicting himself, and how to try to understand that. Give it one step further very quickly before we get into the piece of Rav Kook. This goes back to perhaps even understanding of what Torah is all about. Back in Sefer Shemot, at the end in Parshat Mishpatim and Perek Dalet. So the Torah tells us that at Ma'amad Har Sinai, there's a machloket whether it's before or after the Aseret HaDibrot were given to us, but regardless, it is part of the Sinai experience. There's a pasuk where it talks about the El Atzilei b'nei Yisrael lo shalach et yado vayechazu et Elohim vayochlu vayishtu. That God did not reach out His hand to the nobility of Bnei Yisrael. They saw God and they ate and they drank. It's a very difficult pasuk, and I don't want to get into trying to understand this entire pasuk. There are those who say, well, that part of the sin at that point was that they ate and they drank. There they are having some kind of prophetic vision, and they're eating and they're drinking. But the Ramban, same Ramban, very much in keeping with the Igeret HaKadosh, says something else entirely. He says, no, asu, why did they eat? V'tam v'yishtu, she'asu simcha v'yom tov. They made a kiddush. Ki chen chova lismoach b'kabbalat haTorah. Because of course, we're supposed to be happy. We've just received the Torah. So what should a Jew do when he receives the Torah? What do we do on Simchat Torah? We make a kiddush. That is totally appropriate. It goes back to Ma'amad Har Sinai. And then with the other proof texts in this regard, he says this is which the Midrash has a similar idea with regard to Shlomo HaMelech. And the Midrash says, Amar Rebbe Elazar mikan she'osim mishteh legomra shel Torah. So this is the source for making a kiddush at a siyum. Because if you think about it, making a siyum, making a kiddush, two really contradictory impulses. Here you are celebrating a spiritual milestone by having a shot of single malt. They don't really match. They don't match. They are very much poles apart. If you have a dialectic between the physical and the spiritual, but the Ramban is saying, no, that's not our vision. Our vision is one where we're able to bring these two things together. However, you have this isn't in the Rambam, but the Gemara uses that same pasuk, and to say that the eating and drinking has to be viewed metaphorically. Olam haba ein bo lo achila v'lo shtiya. The world to come has no eating, has no drinking, but rather it's a question of imbibing spiritually from God. How do I know that? Shenemar vayechazu et ha'elohim vayochlu vayishtu. Based on this pasuk, the pasuk has to be understood metaphorically, that they ate it up, they drank it up, they drank up the vision. But it's not that they physically actually ate and drank, because that would be unbecoming. Rather, they have this idea of the spirituality. The same thing, by the way, can be understood with those of you who've been learning Masechet Avot during the time of Sfira. So last Shabbat, we finished Masechet Avot, and we have the Mishnah that says, Kachi darka shel Torah, this is the way of the Torah. Pat b'melech tochal u'mayim b'shura tishtev al aretz tishan v'chayei tza'ar tichyeu v'torah ata amel. What is the way of the Torah? To eat a little bread and salt, to drink water in measurements, meaning not even your water should be extravagant in terms of the amounts. Al haaretz tishan, sleep on the ground, and chayei tza'ar tichyeh, live the life of tsar u'v'torah ata amel. And that is how you will toil in Torah. Even the term amelim b'Torah, to be to be toiling in Torah, that is something which is also indicative of a sense of bringing it away from the physical side. And the Rambam says that explicitly. He says it in Hilchot Talmud Torah, Lo yasiach l'dato l'dvarim acherim, lo yasim libo sheikne Torah im ha'osher v'kavod ka'achat. It's impossible to have Torah and wealth and have honor together, because kachi darka shel Torah, and this is the way to go about it. Others understood that idea. Rashi, for example, in Avot, says that not to understand it as an ideal, but rather as a requirement, meaning that it doesn't matter what your financial status is, even if you are a person who is penniless and all you have to eat is a bit of bread dipped in salt. Al timna me'asok b'Torah. So do not stop from involving yourself in Torah. So you have these different approaches, and as I said, within the Rambam and the Ramban, I'm just pointing out this contradiction in their positions themselves. Now, I've given it some thought. I've talked to other people. I haven't seen anything really written to try to explain where this is coming from. My best guess, if you will, is that the Rambam in the Moreh Nevuchim, that is the idea that the Rambam is trying to speak, if we will, as an ideal, and saying that we should be viewing our physicality as something which is a mark of shame. But in Hilchot Deot, what he is speaking of is that the question is, what do you do with that? Because whether or not ideally we should have been created directly into Olam Haba, but we weren't. God had his rationale and did not create us that way. How part of our challenge is how we navigate this physical world. And navigating the physical world doesn't mean that the is not the excuse me, dealing with the physical world doesn't mean to negate it. That perhaps is a logical approach to take, but the Rambam feels that ultimately it's a counterproductive tack that should be avoided. And that's what the Gemara is saying, that it's a choteh. The Torah has given us enough to work with in terms of the restrictions that we have, that we can become spiritual individuals without adding additional restrictions to ourselves. And whereas the Rambam on the other hand, the Ramban on the other hand, is saying ideally that there is value in this world. There's nothing which is negative. At the same time, a person who is pushing himself at least a little bit in the direction of kedusha by taking additional steps is someone who is considered to be lauded. Perhaps. I think that it still requires more work to try to understand both of their approaches. I want to take a look in the 20 minutes or so that we have till the end of the shir at a very fascinating piece. It's a Gemara in Brachot, and the way that Rav Kook explains this Gemara in the Ein Ayah is really masterful. He says the following. Okay, there we go. He says the following: Reb Zera chalash. Rabbi Zera, and here you have the split screen. You can see the English as well. Rabbi Zera fell ill. Okay. So Rabbi Zera fell ill. All agabe Rabbi Avahu, and so Rabbi Avahu went to visit him. Kabel aleh. So Rabbi Avahu said, "Im mitapech katina charich shakeh, avidna yom etav l'Rabbana." If the little one with the scorched legs recovers, I'll make a feast for the rabbis. Itpach, indeed, he did recover. Avad sudata l'kula. So he made Rabbi Avahu made a kiddush for everyone. Kimata l'mishrei. So when it came time for the meal to begin, Amar le Rabbi Zera lishrei lanmar. So he said to Rabbi Zera, please cut the challah, right? Be the one who cuts the bread. Rabbi Zera looked at him and said, no, that doesn't make sense. Why? Don't you agree with the position? Somebody is playing with the screen. Okay, so Amar Le, so don't you say that Rabbi Zera responds to Rabbi Avahu, so don't you know what Rabbi Yochanan said? Rabbi Yochanan said, Bal habayit botzeya. So you made the kiddush, you paid for everything, you invited everyone, so you should be the one who is making the motzi. I might be the guest of honor, but I'm still the guest. You're the Bal habayit. Kimata levruche, so now they had the meal, now they come in time to bench. Amar le navrich lanmar. So Rabbi Avohu turns to Rabbi Zera and he says, okay, I made the motzi, but you should you should lead the benching. So Rabbi Zera has an answer for that as well. He said, Amar le lo savar le mar lahad Rav Huna. So don't you agree with what Rav Huna said, namely that Dimin Bavel from Bavel de Amar Botzea Mivarech. It's the person who made the motzi, who cut the challah, he, the balabayit in effect, he should lead the benching. The Gemara asks, what was Rebbe Avahu thinking? The halacha is like Rav Huna, it's a basic halacha. And the Gemara said that Rebbe Avahu disagreed, and indeed the halacha, as many of you are familiar with, follows the position of Rebbe Avahu. Ki hada amar Rebbe Yochanan. What Rabbi Yochanan had said, Mishum de Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, Bal habayit botzea va'oreach mivarech. It is the person who has the Bal habayit who makes the motzi, but it's the guest who leads the benching. And then the Gemara explains why, that the Bal habayit is the person who is knows how much food that there is, how many chalot you have for Friday night, how many chalot you have for Shabbos morning, balances in his mind, knows exactly how big a slice to give to each guest so that there will be enough bread throughout the meal, whereas the guest has no knowledge of what's in the kitchen. And the oreach, on the other hand, should lead the benching in order to bless the balabayit and to thank him. That's the end of the Gemara. Now, there's a lot of things that are going on in this Gemara that need to be explained. First of all, why does the Gemara tell us the story? It's a nice story, but why can't we just get to the halachic bottom line to know, okay, who should cut the bread, who should lead the benching? That's really what we care about in the Gemara. That's number one. Number two is, back in the original story, when Rabbi Zera was sick, Rabbi Avo calls him this really funny name. He calls him the little person with the little one with the scorched legs, right? That's a really funny name to have, right? To call someone, right? He's shorty with the burnt leg, right? Where does that come from? And why is that relevant? Why didn't he just say mar the way that he says later? So what's going on? So there's a little bit of a background here. Background is that Rabbi Zera, Gemara in Bava Metzia, Rabbi Zera was a person who came from Bavel. He made Aliyah. There's all sorts of stories about Rabbi Zera's Aliyah for another time. Rabbi Zera, the Gemara says the following: Ki salik la'ara di Yisrael. When Rabbi Zera, is someone working with the screen there? Rabbi Zera came to Eretz Yisrael, Yativ Meya Ta'anita Delishtach Gemara Bavla Amine. So Rabbi Zera, when he made Aliyah, he wanted to become an Israeli. He wanted to remove the Tuma of Bavel from him, not only the Tuma of Bavel, but even the Torah of Bavel, right? He wanted to be pure Israel. And how did he do that? He fasted 100 days. In order to remove the Babylonian influence from him. Then the Gemara says, Yativ Meya Achrina. He fasted a second 100 days in order that Rabbi Elazar should be well, because, and he had a bit of an ulterior motive here, Rabbi Elazar was the Minahel. He was the administrator of the yeshiva in Tiberia, where Rabbi Yochanan was the Rosh Yeshiva. And Rabbi Zera was afraid that if anything should befall Rabbi Elazar, so then Rabbi Zera would be appointed the Menahel. He would be appointed the administrator, and he really didn't want to have to deal with those administrative headaches. So he fasted another 100 days for Rabbi Elazar's health. Then he Yativ Meya Achrine. He fasted a third 100. Right, we're up to 300 days of consecutive fasting. Al obviously he ate at night, but really think about 10 months lahavdil of Ramadan. He fasted another 100 days. Why? Delo nishlot beinura de Gehenna. In order that the fire of Gehenna not would be powerless against him, in terms of the translation. Right. So the how do you know if your fasting is doing the job? So every 30 days, the Gemara says, he checked it. Shagar tanura solik viyatev begave. So he would fire up an oven and he would sit inside the oven. Because after all, if the oven is too hot to handle, so certainly Gehenna is too hot to handle. But if the oven is not, if I'm fireproof in an oven, so maybe I'll be fireproof in Gehenna as well. So every 30 days during this 100-day period, he would do this. And it worked. The fire didn't impact him. Yom Achad Yavu Rabbanan Eina. So one day the Chachamim looked at this and looked askance at this activity. As he did this probably in the privacy of his own home, but one day someone was passing in the window, sees him getting into the oven. Ichrechu shake, so his leg became burnt. Vikarule, and they called him Katin Charich Shake. That's how he got the nickname. Why? Well, presumably, if you're able to fit inside an oven, you're not that big. So he was a small person, and now he had the burnt leg. This became his nickname. That's what the Gemara is saying. Now, a crazy story, and a story that the Rav Kook brings together with the first story. And basically, Rav Kook says the following. Rav Kook says that Rabbi Zera, and I'm going to say this outside because so that I don't go overtime. Basically, Rav Kook, but please at your leisure, take a look at Rav Kook's words. The English translation is mine, and I take any responsibility for mistranslation. But basically, Rav Kook says the following. Rabbi Zera was, I'll just read that first line that he says, is Haita anava betachlita. He was the humility incarnate. He was the extreme version of humility in this world, basically always trying to improve himself, always feeling that he was not where he should be. And his tool, his methodology was by self-affliction. And the self-affliction that he took was the 300 days of fasting. The self-affliction that he took was the going into the oven. And now that by the Rav Kook says, the punishment for Rabbi Zera of his leg being scorched was basically a metaphor. The leg is, if we take a look in terms of from a physical perspective, our legs are basically, they're not a vital organ. God forbid, people can survive and get by if they are paralyzed in one way or another, but they are our legs and are obviously critical for our functioning in this world in as comfortable and as successful a manner as possible. The body, if you will, are the legs of the soul. The body is something which is not perhaps vital to spirituality, but is something that if we are, God forbid, ill, if we are suffering, then it makes it much more difficult for us to focus on our for the soul to, if you will, to focus on its spirituality. The legs being burnt, Rav Kook says, is basically an indication to Rabbi Zera that he's gone too far, and that he has to take better care of his physical health. Rabbi Abba was of the same opinion, and Rabbi Abba, in terms of feeling that Rabbi Zera had gone too far, and that basically now he sees his colleague Rabbi Zera, who is ill, and Rabbi Abba suspects that perhaps the reason why he is ill is because he's up to his old tricks, that he has started his fasting again, and that there is something that is wrong with his approach to his spirituality. Rabbi Abba, in fact, says that when Rabbi Zera recovers, then he will do an opposite. He'll take the polar opposite tack of what Rabbi Zera was doing. Instead of fasting, we'll celebrate it with a feast. And I'm going to not only celebrate it with this Kiddush, I'm going to invite all of the Chachamim, because we are going to be giving, in effect, making a statement by this meal. We're going to be making a statement that the Rabbi Zera approach is the wrong approach. That at least for maybe perhaps for Rabbi Zera himself, and certainly in terms of it being a model for spiritual behavior for the rest of us. So Rabbi Zera is now put into a very difficult position, because he's the guest of honor at a feast, which is a slap against his theological position and his philosophical position. So Rabbi Abba, without saying it explicitly, or perhaps only hinting at it by saying that when the little one with the scorched leg, the katina im charich shake, when he is well, I'll make the kiddush. That's all that Rabbi Abba has to say. Rabbi Zera gets the hint. He understands the message. And now Rabbi Abba turns to Rabbi Zera and says to him, not only are you going to be the guest of honor here, you're going to be the balabayit. You're going to cut the bread. You're going to, in effect, say that you have to accept the fact that your position is being rejected. And Rabbi Zera says, now you've gone one step too far. I'm willing to be a guest at this meal. I'm willing to allow others to disagree with my position. I'm willing for them to say that as a public policy, the Rabbi Zera approach is inappropriate. But don't make me the balabayit. Don't you know what Rabbi Yochanan says? It's the balabayit, who should be cutting the bread. You're the balabayit of this simcha. I'm just the guest. So here you cut the bread. And then Rabbi Abba turns to him and says, so Rabbi Abba accepts that. There's no question in the Gemara. The Gemara never asks, well, what was Rabbi Abba thinking? Rabbi Abba accepts Rabbi Zera's implicit critique and cuts the bread. Rabbi Zera, on the other hand, now is at the meal finishes, and Rabbi Abba turns to Rabbi Zera and says, even as the guest, you should lead the benching. And Rabbi Zera says, I disagree. Here there is the machloket as to who should be benching. Rabbi Zera is saying the person who cut the bread, the balabayit, he's the one who should be leading the benching. And it's interesting to go back to the beginning of that Gemara. I don't think Rav Kook mentions this per se, but that Rabbi, he said, Lo savar la mar laha de Rav Huna de min Bavel. The same Rabbi Zera is saying here, even though I fasted 100 days to remove the Babylonian influence, Here, I agree with the Babylonians. It's the person who is the Bal Habayit, he leads the benching, because the benching, in effect, is the capstone for what the meal stood for. And the Bal Habayit was responsible for this meal. He's the one who should cut the bread at the beginning. He's the one who should say the motzi. He's the one who should be leading the Birkat HaMazon at the end. Then the Gemara says, well, what would Rabbi Abba think? And Rabbi Abba says, no, here, even the guest can lead the benching. And of course, in this regard, in terms of benching, the halacha is like Rabbi Abba. But the idea here that we have, that this really getting back to the beginning of the shir, I take a look at the Nazir. And the Nazir is an extreme example of this type of position, but it's not the most severe example. The person who self-afflicts himself, the person who is involved or tries to remove himself from involvement in this world, that's the really extreme situation. That's the Rebbe Zera approach. Over the course of the last, I would say, 2 centuries, if throughout Jewish history, going back to at least the Tanaim and maybe even earlier than that, we had these 2 poles of spirituality. The one which is rejecting our physical selves as much as humanly possible. The other one which, while perhaps maybe even embracing and in its most explicit form, but certainly is valuing our physicality, the way that the Ramban in the Igeret HaKodesh says that God created us as physical beings, and God intends us to appreciate our physicality and to take pleasure in our physicality. So that is these 2 different approaches. Over the course of the last 200 years, the former, this idea of self-affliction, has become a very fringe type of position, if accepted at all. And it's been, however, replaced by, if you will, the idea, and something which is mentioned in many Musar Svarim, the Silat Yesharim is full of it, that basically to view this world as being a type of nisayon, a type of test that we have to overcome. That is, if you will, the spiritual descendant of the position which is viewing the physicality as being something which should be, ideally at least, rejected altogether. For perhaps different sociological reasons, that's no longer accepted, but the core idea to minimize what we do to the extent that it will further our spiritual goals, and to take no breaks whatsoever, or to look at leisure time as being only something of necessity, but should be something that we look at with a jaundiced type of eye, trying to minimize to the most part. So that position still exists. That is the, if you will, the echo of the Rambam in Moreh Nevuchim. It's the echo of Rebbe Zera. It comes down to this day as well. That becomes the dominant position, at least when I was in yeshivot, of what is that's preached. But there is the position of Rabbi Abba, which I think, and the position of the Ramban, which I think could very well be is as strongly rooted, perhaps even more strongly rooted as the former, and that is saying, no, there is value in the physical in of itself. That the physical itself, not because we in any way are celebrating the physical, but rather the physical has been given to us, and it's not to be viewed as a nisayon, it's not to be viewed as a test, but rather it's to be viewed as an opportunity to allow us to appreciate this world and to use this world as a springboard for our spiritual growth, which we all agree is the ultimate goal. And the question of how do we get there? And this is the idea that Rabbi Abba is trying to say. This is the idea that the Ramban is putting together as being already at the foot of Har Sinai. Vayechazu ha'elokim, they saw God, vayochlu vayishtu, and they ate and they drank. That the simcha of a mitzvah, that what we take and we say that this physical food, this physical drink, everything about this world that God created at least, can be elevated and can be incorporated into our spiritual growth. There are those of you listening who are of the Reb Abba camp. There are those of you who are perhaps of the Reb Zera camp. Be'ezrat Hashem, we should all be able to sit in the meal together and to move forward and to become Kedoshim, each in their own way. Okay.